Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. Steve Toase, welcome to the Writer's Gym.
Thank you for having me on.
It's not our first welcome because you've been sponsored writing with me for a while now for Macmillan Cancer Support once a year, when you brought that beautiful mug with the trees on it.
Yeah, this one.
Okay, go on, give him the mug. We were in the writing room this morning with the membership, and actually the mug did come up in conversation. We do talk about writing as well, but the annual coffee and writing day of getting together is probably when I see you the most, really, isn't it? Because you're in Germany.
Yeah, we've been here for about 7 years now. So
we'll talk about the books and we'll talk about life in general, but something that actually came up when I was talking to the membership this morning about life and writing and how these things leak into each other. I know you know what I'm going to say because I always love the coffee and cake adventures, is the way that our interests as writers and working with ourselves in terms of what gets the writing out of us. One of my most literal examples of that I've really enjoyed was you taking the bike out, going and getting a coffee, photographing the cake. And I think it's such a brilliant example of a healthy writing life. Do you want to maybe tell people about that as a way in?
Yeah, it's one of those things. I'm self-employed. I work at home. So, I ride motorbikes. It's a big part of my life. We'll probably get onto that in a bit. But it can be very hard to find a reason to go out for a ride. So I was talking to my wife, and we'd been going to cafes. We go to cafes a lot. And, I'd started when I was taking my son to clubs, sitting in cafes and reading. And she goes, well, why don't you just go out, ride the bike and do a little bit about the cafes? And she came up with a name. So there's this thing in Germany called Kaffee and Kuchen, where you go out in an afternoon, you meet your friends, you had coffee and cake. And there's a type of motorbike from England in the 1960s, 1950s called a cafe racer. So it became Cafe and Kuchen racer. So I ride my motorbike to a cafe, take some photographs, enjoy cake, drink coffee, ride my motorbike back. And, it's just a way of combining those interests. And then I write about it on my blog.
And it's become part of the ritual, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Do you see a lot of the sort of geography and the life that you're living in your writing now?
I do to a certain extent, but I think that's something you have to really put an effort in with when you work at home. And I think it can become a real issue. So, I've been self-employed. I've been writing since 2008 and self-employed on my other side since about 2011. And it can be very isolating. So even though if I turn the camera around, you could see the Franconian forest, which is opposite me. Actually getting out into the landscape takes effort, and it's something you have to actively do to then bring it back into what you're writing, I think. So we're about 20 kilometres, about 15 miles from the old Germany, in the border between East Germany and West Germany. And that's definitely starting to come into my writing a lot, one of my longer projects. So I do try and work it in where I can.
That's so interesting about how you can geographically be very near to something, but also the liminality of that as a writer working at home, you are seeing it at a distance through a window. And I feel like that about London quite a lot of the time. It's almost overwhelming quite how many stories are interweaving with mine, how very much is going on that I could go out there and become a part of very, very easily, and finding that balance between keeping your own space and very literally in our case creating your own stories, but also being able to see that through the window.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, here I'm a bit more isolated. We're in not a rural part of Bavaria, but definitely a more countryside of it. Whereas when I was in Munich, I was part of a wider community of writers. And that's maybe something I miss a little bit because I'm at my desk all week. When I want a break at a weekend, I don't want to then be sat in front of my desk. So I don't tend to join online groups. In Munich, I was part of a thing called a Shut Up and Write group where we would meet in a cafe. Again, cafes. We would introduce ourselves, write for an hour in silence, talk about the work and maybe do another hour. And that was really useful for me. A lot of people went because it was the only time, because they have full-time jobs where they could carve out time to write. Whereas I was actually using it to carve out time to be sociable away from my main body of writing.
That's a very interesting position to come at from the opposite direction. Did you get to know people within that group? Did you have conversations about that?
Yeah, very much so, and that sort of contrasting element of looking for the social side, particularly, but within a writing environment. So people who are going through similar things. So I could talk about writing, but I'm not necessarily going to go, I need an hour of just getting work done because I've been doing that all week.
Somebody else said to me relatively recently that she started to newly appreciate the working time that she had based on something a bit similar to you, where the other people within the situation were saying, if I had these many hours, I'd get that much done. And it can be, from our point of view, quite a sort of idealistic or naive way of looking at lots of time, because, lots of time can be overwhelming. You do need to find your own pattern and your own structure and what works for you. But to look at it and go, it's just plain nice to have. She said that was a good moment because it reminded her that we do have that freedom to decide what works for us, and that it's on us to make those conditions happen.
Definitely. And I think it's very easy. I'm very privileged in that I have 3 days a week where I just write. I have 2 days a week where I do my day job, although I do earn money from my writing. But I have 3 days a week where I write. But also from that can sort of turn around where if you're not being productive, you can feel like, well, I'm very privileged to have this time and I'm wasting it. So you have to get that balance mentally about how you treat that time when you have an abundance of it.
And meeting yourself in the middle, that there will be times where we can push a little bit harder and that's useful, but there will be other times where that sense of wasting can be extremely counterproductive in itself, can't it? That if you're having a go at yourself rather than acknowledging this is what is going to work for me, how do you have those conversations with yourself?
Well, I'm very good at compartmentalizing. So we may have been going to get to this later in the conversation, but I think it's relevant now. So I have different writing hats. I write short fiction. I've normally got a longer fiction project on the go. I've got a novella come novel at the moment, but I also write for magazines. I write non-fiction. And what I do is I have a day a week for each. I can change those days around, but I have one day writing short stories, which was today. I wrote 1,000 words earlier on today. I have one day where I'll work on articles, which will be tomorrow. I've got something I need to finish off, and then I review as well for Fortean Times. So I'll do that work on that day. And then another day I'll work on my novel. But I think it's very important that you know what the nature of the work of writing is. I mean, it's not just sat in front of a keyboard being putting words on the paper, because there comes a time when you have to edit, when you have to look at the work, when you have to be inspired, when you have to have conversations, and not downplay the importance of those in your work week or in your work time. But one of the nice things I can do is if, say, tomorrow I wake up and I'm like, I really can't, I'm not in the headspace to do that article, I can go, but I can do some work on the novella, or I can finish out a short story, or I can do my Patreon story for the week. It's ways of being flexible, but having boundaries, if that makes sense.
Oh, categorically. And it was lovely hearing you use the word inspiration about not what happens initially, but what happens from what is on the page, because that is such an important thing, that it's not about sitting waiting for ideas.
Yeah.
It's about where you take those initial layers once they've arrived.
Definitely. It's that thing that, people come and say, I've got an idea for a story. It's great having the idea for a story. It's getting the work done and drawing in that extra inspiration to make it different and make it your story, so. Yeah,
I like that. Perspiration first, inspiration second.
Yeah. The other thing that I do at the moment is my son's 13 and he started doing a bit of writing. So we go and do writing sprints, again, to a cafe. We'll go off either on a motorbike or we'll go into town if the weather's not great. We'll sit down and we'll do 15 minutes and then we'll have a break and then we'll do another 15 minutes. And why that's useful to me is I have a Patreon where I post a story a week, just a flash fiction story, and I'll write it in those times. Having those little bits of time that are dedicated but flexible, I think, are really, really important.
Did you have somebody doing for you what you're doing for your son in that situation when you were starting off?
Not specifically at that age, but when I was about 14, my dad knew I was into writing and one of his friends wrote poetry. So she took me to a local writer's circle and everyone was sharing their favourite book. I remember this very vividly. And someone read the opening paragraph to Clive Barker's Weave World. And I was just blown away. And that really brought me into that side of things that's very much in my work, which isn't necessarily second world fantasy, but it's you step off a pavement in this world into another world, whether that's grotesque in the most beautiful way, like Clive Barker or fantastical like Charles Delin, or, there's something just beyond if we step over into it. And that, I think, was my real introduction to putting the work in. I had a teacher at school and who was also supportive as well when I was a bit younger. But I went through a lot of stuff in my teenage years, and which culminated in me being kicked out of home. So, it's very difficult to pinpoint times, but that time going to Writer's Circle was definitely someone took me and said, here, look at this. This is what you can do.
And that sense of a foot in different worlds, that you became homeless or in housing, vulnerably housed.
Yeah.
That sense of it is another example of being in different worlds and how different people see you and how you react to others, how other people can be strangers or dangerous in a slightly different way to if you're secure in your own world. I sort of feel like maybe I've read into it since reading the wonderful article about that, which is on your website for anybody who's not found it. But I did feel when we shared a reading at one of the conventions, that when we were both reading, that sense of another world being very close to this one, but also very far from it, that feels like a theme possibly, or something that I see in you that you're interested in.
It is. So I was kicked out at 16. I was spent time, no fixed abode or vulnerably housed. So when I got kicked out of my first bedsit, which I'd acquired after being thrown out of home, I was evicted from there with 3 days notice. And, so it was really transient in some places. But where I was homeless wasn't London, and it wasn't a big city. I was homeless in Harrogate, which is seen as a very rich, affluent town. But it has a lot of hidden homelessness. It has a lot of houses, bedsits. It has a lot of people who aren't sleeping on the streets, they're sleeping in tents in the woods. So it's very much that, where there's a world which people aren't acknowledging, both in the vocabulary they used to talk about the town and the vocabulary they used to talk about the places. If I go to most places and say I'm from Harrogate, they go, oh, Harrogate, it's posh. Not the side that I saw, both growing up working class and also being underclass, being homeless and being vulnerably housed and being on income support at 16 and all the stuff that comes with that was very much hidden, especially at the time. So that's why we, when we did a project later on, which we may return to talk about, Haunt, which was about hidden homelessness in Harrogate. That's why we called it Haunt, was about, ghosts, people who were not visible to the area, the places that you haunt, the different meanings, and it really had a resonance for that experience.
In terms of emotionally and practically moving towards a writing career, I guess what I want to say is, what happened next?
Well, I'm an archaeologist, so the thing that got me through a lot of that time was I always wanted to be an archaeologist. I was also very lucky. I met my wife quite young. We met when I was 19, she was 17, been together for 30 years. So I've had quite a stable situation there. I went to university. I did my HND, my degree and my MA in archaeology. I worked in commercial archaeology. And then in 2008, I was getting very interested in doing some kind of writing. So I picked up, you've probably seen it, the Writers Bureau course. And I did it. There was an exercise in there to write a review. And I wrote a review about this book about biker culture. And at the time, I knew the editor at Blue of Backstreet Heroes. She was the editor at the time. I showed it to her. And she goes, yes, I can use that. And so she ran the review in the magazine. And then I did a couple more, and then she started paying me. And then I started writing features for them. And I did that for a while. I used that to leave writing for Fortean Times, reviewing for them. And I've been writing and reviewing for them since 2008, 2009. And it's using it to get to the next step. And then when it came to fiction, there was a website called the Endicott Studio, which was based around Terry Windlin, the work of Terry Windlin, Charles DeLint, Ellen Kushner. I think Ellen Datlow may have been involved. I'm not completely sure off the top of my head. But they had a list of publications on there. And I'd started writing. I wrote a story set in where we lived in Armley in Leeds at the time. And then I'd started writing more short stories, and I went down the list and I submitted them until I got accepted. I actually ended up getting in 3 of the publications in that list over time. So that was one aspect of it. But the other one, jumping back a little bit, I started writing fiction, and I was writing fairly long short stories, and someone started an open mic night nearby actually in Harrogate. And it was open to poem and prose, which is quite unusual because a lot of open mic nights tend to be focused on poetry. So I went, but what was happening was my short stories were too long for 5-minute slots. So I'd read half a short story one month and then half a short story the next month, and it just wasn't working because some people wouldn't be there. And so I started writing a lot of flash fiction, and that really helped focus what I was doing and using the skills I'd learned in writing articles and writing compact work to then write fiction. And that's something that stayed with me. So yeah, it's all sort of fed into where I am now.
It sounds like a very good lesson in economy in a slightly different way to the way reviewing is a lesson in economy.
Yeah, it's the economy, and doing flash fiction, although I tend to do that for my Patreon, I love the economy of making words do several things. So you've got to very quickly world build. One of my favourite short stories, and I should read it again, I haven't read it in ages, is called Branch. And the first line is, the first tree I saw hitchhiking, I nearly didn't stop. And so you've thrown into this surreal world. That comes from the fact I've got a really bad astigmatism, and I was in the car. I was in the passenger seat, I'll hasten to add. My wife was driving, and I thought I saw a hitchhiker by the side of a road, and it was a tree. And it set off this story. So this feeds in, my archaeological interest is in embodiment and how we experience the world differently through our physicality, and how our body, that changes through ableist spaces, it changes through when we get older, it changes through gender, etc., etc. There's a very good book called Embodied Geographies by Elizabeth Teaver, which talks about this and inspired a lot of where I studied with archaeology. Physicality of experience then fed into that story, which I was then able to take and make something very surreal and world build very fast. So yeah, I love that with flash fiction. It's an absolute joy.
And it's very interesting for perception as well, that we, being as we are in whatever brain we are in, there is, it's never about objective reality. It is always about that specificity of how does it look for that character. So I love that example of the tree, that to anybody else, something might be obvious, but the story is what's in that character. You see, you've reminded me of a sort of a silly example that I was walking with an old boyfriend, and we were walking past a pub, and we were joking about the career of a pop star at the time, and he said what I thought he said, that it turns out he did not say. I thought he said, oh yeah, she'll be playing in The Rodent's Crown in 10 years' time. And I just laughed and laughed because I just thought it was such a perfect name for a rundown pub.
Yeah.
And then purely by chance, through conversation later that day, it transpired that he'd actually said The Rose and Crown, and so which brain made the joke? Because I thought I was just hearing it, but he never said it at all. It just emerged.
Yeah.
And that we talk a lot in horror, well, in fiction generally, about liminal space. And perception is really that, isn't it?
It is, definitely. We all live in different worlds. There's I got very interested in the ideas of Lakoff and Johnson and the philosophy of the flesh, which talks about colour, and how, because of the way our individual cones and rods are arranged, what I see as red may not, and is almost certainly not what you see as red, but we experience it differently, and I think it's a really powerful tool. Another one that I love, actually, it's from Embodied Geographies. She talks about how children subvert space. And I think it's one of the real issues with when people write children. For a while, I was a long-listing judge on the Aesthetica Creative Writing Award, and you would get people trying to write children, but they weren't. They were writing an adult's perception of how children see the world rather than how children see. And it's not to do with childish, infantilized language. It's to do with perception, scale. And so she was talking particularly about how children will subvert space, like building sites, and go in and make construction sites on the sand, or they will go and use benches as spaceships. And that's their world. That's how they perceive it. It's interesting. I don't know if you've been watching Aliens Earth, a new series at all.
I haven't, actually, but it's just made the list.
But because one of the things that it was critiqued a little bit for was just born children as adults, because you have these children who've been put into these adult synthetic bodies. But actually, what they're not doing is doing adults being naive. They're doing really, really good childish characterization of how children would play and be petty, and it's really nicely characterized. So yeah, I think it's fascinating the way we differently experience the world and how we can then take that into our writing.
When you have moments, if and when you have moments where maybe something isn't quite working, or that creative confidence is lacking, What are the things you either say or do to bring yourself into a better zone?
I step away from it quite often and pick up something else. Are you familiar with the oblique strategies cards?
I am, yes, but please pretend I'm not. Please talk about them a lot.
So I have a box of oblique strategy cards, which you can see there, by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. Yes. And there are a series of cards which are creative inspiration. So they will have phrases on, and generally the idea is you shuffle them and you take one out. So picking one up is question the heroic approach. So I use those a lot, but I have two, which I keep out and which I normally have on display. One is, it's just simply, it says, do the words need changing? And the other one, which I love, is gardening, not architecture. And I think for me, that's a really important one when it comes to writing, because we all have our metaphors. You know, there's a metaphor of the fossil, which we chip away at and find. There's the sculpture, which we find the sculpture in the stone of the writing. And then there's architecture. But all of those, once they're done, they're static. Whereas if you for me, you think of it as a garden. You can take things out, you can replant them, you can move them around, you can prune the tree, you can dig up the flower bed, but it will still be the garden. And I think that's really powerful because it lets you play a lot more.
Another thing I like about that is there's no right and wrong answer, which is important, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just about playing quite often and seeing what works.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely about getting into that space where you are playing, and you are, the other thing when you talk about gardening that strikes me is that you are caring for something and you're not in full control of it, because the other thing that is so important is not being in full control of it, is allowing that. Definitely.
And I think the other thing that's really freeing, I've done quite a few art projects as well, so art commissions involving writing, and it goes over into when you get commissioned maybe to write a short story, is keeping in the back of your mind, they're commissioning you to write what you write. So it can be very easy to go, I'm going to write this because they'll probably want this. It's like, okay, they're paying me because they want me to write what I write. And that can actually be very freeing when you get in that mindset.
Yeah, and it is such a healthy thing, isn't it, that we can spend so much energy on trying to prove to ourselves that we're worthy rather than realising you're here. Yeah. It is all about the curiosity. Do you focus on that?
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get there, and it can then be quite hard to stay there depending on how you're feeling at the time, I think.
It does. There's always knockbacks. It's very easy in something like writing to feel like it's hierarchical and feel like when I get to the next stage, everything will be resolved, or when I reach this. And you realise, I think, as you meet more writers, that everyone, it sounds cliched, but everyone's colleagues rather than competitors. And you realise that because you might not get into an anthology, or you might not get a story published. And, I've had weeks where I've had 5 or 6 rejections, sometimes on another day, and you take a step back and you take a breath and you go, okay, I'll take a pause and then I'll resubmit them. But everyone's just further along. And I think when you do achieve a couple of things, you realise it's not going to magically solve everything. So you have to look at it and go, what do I put a value on? And I put a value on being able to tell the stories and being able to do what I want, and hopefully finding a home for it.
I'm going to go to a slightly more utilitarian area of making a writing career work, which is, are you a shutting the door person? Are you a communicating, I'm not available between these hours or these hours? How, in practical terms, do you make an art life work when there are family and other things going on?
One, have an understanding family, but have an understanding family who realise you're taking it seriously. So I shut the door, and then occasionally I'll emerge and I'll give Annie, my wife, something to read. And normally she'll have to make up her own ending because the type of stuff that I write. It's not, I write horror and it can be quite body horror and it's not for everybody. And so she will often make up her own endings. But I will generally start about 7:30, 8 in the morning. The door's shut. I will write. The way I look at it is like this. I will write 500 words a day when I sit down and I'm working on something. If I write 1,000 words, that's great. If I get 2,000 words written, that's fantastic. I'm pretty prolific, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily the best way or the way for everybody. But it works for me.
You said it's at 7:30 or 8 start.
Yeah.
Is there a time when the brain says, no sale? Do you find that it has a natural stopping point?
Yeah, it's normally after lunch. So, it's normally 2, 3 in the afternoon. I'll stop and I'll do something else. Unless it's something really major, like a load of revisions to go through, or, I have a deadline. I rarely have deadlines. I'm quite lucky with my editors, but.
That's interesting. Can I ask you about that? Because lucky and not having deadlines for me would be absolute polar opposites, because I have a brain that needs to know when the next thing is happening, not just in writing and everything. I like that system. Are you the opposite?
I am most of the time, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I tend to be flexible. I can put things to one side. I can pick them up again. I can go, oh God, this isn't working, So, I mean, like the novella I'm working on at the moment is based around the inner German border. So what I'll do is, if it's just not working, I can jump on my bike, go and ride and have a walk around the town. That's the inspiration for it, and absorb some of that, and hopefully it'll kickstart something.
How does that work in terms of the magazines? Because presumably with Fortean Times, for example, there's the sort of revolving deadlines that you'll need to have certain things in at certain times.
It is genuinely really flexible. It's like, once I've got the reviews together, I get a review page in there. There's no fixed element. Often if I'm pitching to a magazine, like I write for a bike magazine, bits and pieces, I've got a couple of articles to write. They've got enough articles that they'll just slot it in when it comes. Rarely do I have one. It's like, right, we need it for this issue. So it's all freelance work. So I'm very, very lucky like that.
You seem like a very zen freelancer.
Yeah. It's nice to be laid back and chill. But that's the way I've built it, because I know how I work. Yeah. And then I have my website and I do stuff on there. And that's where I do my own things, which is great because, it's getting to play and play with stuff.
You're making me realise how much of a compliment it is to me that you're doing the sponsored write for Macmillan, because that is pretty much the opposite of those situations, isn't it? That we have our day where we do the writing, we have the next day where we do the editing, then it all goes to our other Steve Shaw at Black Shuck Books makes the anthology. And that feels like the opposite the opposite system.
But I'm going to slightly contradict myself, because it comes down to the art element and the challenge element. While I love this for the working stuff as well, I like playing with sort of Aleppo style restrictions. There's a great thing, and I've adapted it. Do you know the author Jeff Noon? So Jeff Noon has a thing called Cobralingus, where he has a series of like gates, so at, not, or, and a series of rules. I think there's about 10 of them, and he uses a random number generator. And so he'll start with a piece of writing and then he'll put it through a series of processes. And I've done similar thematic ones there was an exhibition I was part of for the anniversary of the Apollo landings. So I took some of the transcripts from the communications from the astronauts and then did a thematic similar process, because I like working with restrictions within these things. So it's like the flash fiction. For me, it's quite fun to play with those elements. But when it comes to the longer stuff, it's nice to have a bit of freedom. So
it is quite, I don't precisely mean medium based, but different themes or different ways of writing require different things from you.
Yeah. And I think it just all comes down to being playful. At the end of the day, this is my career. I make money out of my writing, both through the magazine and the short stories. But you find playful things, you find the things that interest you, and I think that's really important. And if it doesn't interest you, I genuinely think you have to find something that does, or find an angle on it that does.
And that is where the confines create inspiration, that is how you work out what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And you find your way to what works for you.
Yeah, definitely.
I completely take your point that having a family who are understanding, but who know you're taking this seriously, this is what it needs. Any, not writing tips, but the politics of writing tips in terms of, because for me, I mean, what I've found really helpful is my partner's a writer, I'm a writer. I close the door and he understands that. And we've got hours for certain things. That's what it's been for us.
Yeah.
Any sort of admin of of making that work?
My wife's a teacher, so she's a kindergarten teacher now, so she has a bit more flexibility, but it's really difficult to pin down. It's just been life. I just shut the door and she's really understanding. It's something that started quite early on, because when I was doing my MA, that was quite intense, long hours on an evening, and it's just like, yeah, shut the door and go on. But, we've been together a long time and we know each other very, very well.
The other thing that I've experienced, I'd be interested to know if it is similar for you, is that the more comfortable you have in the way that you live. And the more deeply you can go into life, the more deeply you can go into art, that there's a security of knowing that the door does shut, but it opens again.
Yeah, definitely. And there's people out there who will support you. And I think the biggest one is when you're having those days which aren't productive, where you maybe get, a tiny bit of a story. And I'm, like I say, I consider myself very privileged, a very lucky position where we've managed to get in a situation where I can have 3 days a week writing. Part of that is to do with the fact that my wife was a teacher, and I give full credit. A lot of men, I think, men especially, don't give credit when they're writers and creative and their partner's supporting them. But I do, she's supporting me. I started off in archaeology, which was never well paid and never secure employment. And then I decided to go into writing. So, it's, so if I have a day where I feel like I'm faffing around and I've got maybe 200 words written and then I've spent a load of time doom scrolling and I've watched some YouTube videos and I just go, I'm really sorry. She goes, look, you've had a day where it's not worked. And next week you'll have a day where you'll crack out 2,000 words. It's fine. Stop stressing. Just do what you need to do. And that's really helpful.
We all need an inner Annie on that, because when you were talking about if I do 2,000 words in a day, brilliant. The implication I was taking, and I don't know if I'm right, is that regardless if it's 2,000 a day or the 500 or fewer, tomorrow the scale starts again. You've still got the same expectation on tomorrow, but the reality of it is that some days are going to suck.
Yeah.
And our brains will make up for it on other days, but we do need to remind ourselves that, don't we?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the other ones was because of this situation where Annie was the one with a solid job. I was a stay-at-home dad when Charlie was young. My son was young. Before he was born, I sound like I'm doing I can write loads of words, but I did this genuinely to prove to myself. I wrote, and it's rubbish, it's never seen the light of day, I wrote an 80,000 word novel in 8 weeks because I wanted to show that I could, under pressure, work. And then when he was, this was actually my day job, not my writing, but it sort of proves it carried over when I was writing as well. I had 3 hours a day when he would nap, and I would have my computer ready and I would sit down and work for 3 hours. And then when he woke up, I would stop. And it's just when you've carved out those little niches, when you get the luxury of a full day, you can really appreciate it and make it work well.
I'm going to ask that magic sneaky question, which is, what haven't I asked you?
No, I can't think of anything. Sorry, I was going to do something about rejections and how you deal with rejections, which seems a really obvious one.
I'd love to know what you're thinking.
So rejections, I think, is something people find really hard about this as a job or as a hobby, because you put everything into it. And it's very easy to say you need to grow a thick skin and deal with it, which is rubbish. It's not about a thick skin, but it's about realizing what a rejection actually means, I think. And it doesn't mean what a lot of people feel it means. It means that your work isn't right at that time. And there's a couple of places I submitted. So Shimmer it actually doesn't exist anymore, but it was one of those places I really wanted to get into, like heartbreakingly wanted to get a story in because it was amazing. And I sent them so much stuff, everything, every piece. And, probably some pieces that weren't even really suitable. And we got rejected, but nice rejections, and they quite often, were personal rejections. And then I got in on the last issue. Oh, and that felt so good. And then it was similar with Deadlands, which eToblo runs now, which is themed about the dead and the lands of the dead. And I got into there, and that was amazing as well. But you have to put your work out there, I think, and you have to realize that it may just be, but it's not right. It's not right for time. Michael Kelly is my editor at Undertow, who published my collection. I send Mike stuff all the time for weird horror, and it doesn't get in. But, I know he likes my stuff because he's published my collection, but it's just not right, or he's got stuff that he would prefer to publish. And that's fine. I'll find home for stuff. And I think the big one was the magazine The Dark, which is well known in genre circles for giving very quick rejections. And I think it's great because then you can turn around and find somewhere that will take it, that will be right for it.
When you said that what rejection is not, it's not we need to develop a thick skin. What would you say the misunderstanding is, or what would you say that it isn't and is?
I would say it's not personal, and I think that's where the idea of developing a thick skin. And don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm emotionless about it, but it doesn't generally bother me until I have 5 arrive on a day, which genuinely has happened. And it was just like, do you know what? I'm just going to take a little moment to sit to one side and collect myself. But it's not personal. You are allowed to feel something from it, but you have to realize it's not necessarily a judgment on the work. And I do believe in the send it out 5 or 6 times and see what happens. And if it comes back after that 6th time and it's still not being accepted, sit with it for a bit, go, is it doing what I want it to do? And if it's yes, then look around and try and find somewhere that it will get in print if that's what you want. And I think there's another one, which is another thing which can be an issue in this profession, which is envy. I think it's very easy to be envious. And I think it's another thing that can eat you up so easily. So I had a situation where someone had been asked to do a commentary on a DVD, on a film. And it's a film in a genre that I deal with. I deal with biker films. My first ever cover for Fortean Times was about biker films and the occult, Pulp Fiction and all this. And there was a little moment when I was like, oh, I wish I'd been asked to do that. And I felt a bit envious of it, genuinely. And I was like, well, one, the person who's putting the DVD together doesn't know me from Adam. And they knew this person and they knew their reputation. It's great. And this person is very well informed. Don't get me wrong. And 2, I was like, how am I going to deal with this? So I went, okay. So I approached them and I interviewed them for my website. And we talked about the film and I interviewed them about the film. And do you know what? It was one of the nicest things for me personally, because it was like, it helped me deal with that little niggling, annoying voice in my head, which I don't like, and bring it back on track and go, you know what? We all love this stuff. And this person was the right person for it. And that's cool. And I can do my own thing and maybe I'll get to do something in the future. Yes.
That's the one that I do in my head, is catching when I can spot myself essentially waiting for the world to be psychic. That person didn't know you, as you say, and now they do. And a lot of envy does tend to overlap with despair, that it makes it seem like people are absolute competitors, like it's binary, it's them or you, which has never been true. And this is why creative confidence is so important. What do I want to create? How do I make it happen? That's exactly what all of this is about.
Absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, it's like if someone picks up your collection from Black Shuck, then they're likely to pick up maybe mine or Kit Powers, or because they'll go, well, this series is good, this writer's good, they're producing good work. We all lift each other up, and I think that's one of the things that I do like about the community on a whole. Obviously there's always bad actors, but as a whole, everyone's really supportive. It's it's really good, and not in a cliched way, but in a genuine. So I first got involved in the British horror community because I got published in Best Horror with Priya Sharma, and I went to FantasyCon in Chester. I walked in, I walked down the corridor, I saw Priya, I introduced myself, gave me a big hug, and then she walked and she introduced me to people like Andrew Freudenberg, and people like Simon Beswick, Rob Shearman, about 10 people. And I just spent the evening with these people, and they're people I genuinely consider friends still now. And there wasn't any exclusion, or, there wasn't any sort of, I can't think of a better word than snobbishness, or, you're not one of us. It was like, wow, you're part of this too. Come and,
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that I think people who have not been to a writing convention as writers don't always know how big a difference it is, that there isn't one of those dividing mirrors that your fan or your player. You're not that at all. Everybody's a person. Everybody's interested in writing. It is a community. It is a convention of people coming together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's not just a community coming together and talking about the best writing routines, or, it's people coming together and going, I really like this author as well. And talking to people in like you say, we're fans as much. I still remember I went to EasterCon because it was in Harrogate, which is my hometown. So it's easy to come back to and find somewhere to stop, which doesn't cost a fortune in hotels. And I met Jeff Noon there. And I was able to go up and go, because he's known for vert and he's known for pollen. And I went up and went, Falling Out of Cars is my favourite book by you. And it's one that doesn't really get talked about. You know, it was great, you know, and I love that about it. I genuinely do.
That's such a lovely thing to hear. I don't have any more questions, but my favourite question about if there's anything else you want to think aloud about before we go, I'm totally open.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be very isolating writing. And, you know, where I am, I mean, this is where I spend 8 hours a day in this room. I'm in a country where my son is fluent in German. He's been going to school here since he was 5. My wife speaks good German. She works in a German-speaking kindergarten. I sit here and write in English, so my German is appalling. So it can be very isolating. But I think that community aspect and building that community aspect is really important. I'm sorry that every time you give me a theme for the Green Ink Right, I turn it into something horrific.
Please do not ever be sorry for subverting a theme. A theme is absolutely there to subvert. So Rhianna Pratchett chose this year's, and it's Somewhere That's Green, Paradises, Utopias and Happy Places. There is no doubt in my mind that it will also be the polar opposite of that. So yes. Please feel free.
Well, you know, the thing about all dystopias is they're a utopia for somebody. So
well, exactly. Yeah. So you may find yourself writing your first utopia.
But no, I've got to say thank you for inviting me to be part of it that first year and continuing to invite me, because I do enjoy the challenge and I do enjoy the boundaries on it.
Well, it is great hanging out with you, as always, both at conventions and in the internet, which I know is not your natural home, but I so appreciate you doing it.
So my next big thing is I'm going to be in Brighton for World Fantasy Con, which is now this year combined with Fantasy Con, the British convention, because my collection, Dirt Upon My Skin, of archaeologically themed horror stories is up for a British Fantasy Award Best Collection, which is the first time I've been up for an award for my own works.
Steve Toase, thank you so much for joining the Writers' Gym.
Yeah, thank you for having me along.
You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach Dr. Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.